understand. The belt against her bare skin, Thomas quoting scripture between strikes, and occasionally saying, "God, take power from the serpent, you are of your father, for he has been a liar, and so you are a liar." Afterward came tender touches and whispered words of love as he took her virginity. He held her close, wiping away her tears, explaining that this was God's design for marriage. The sound of leather moving through air made Rachel freeze. She'd accidentally spilled water while preparing dinner, and now Thomas stood in the doorway, belt in hand, his face a mask of controlled frustration. "You know what happens when we waste what God provides," he said calmly, his voice at odds with the irritation in his eyes. Rachel backed away until she hit the counter, her heart racing against her ribs. "Please, Thomas. It was an accident. Turn around," he instructed. "The children might hear." "I said turn around," Thomas repeated. Rachel turned, gripping the counter's edge, her body tensing in preparation for what was to come. The first strike made her bite her lip to keep from crying out. "The woman led man to sin," Thomas recited as the belt came down again, "so her pain must be greatly increased." When it was over, Thomas hung the belt back on its hook by the kitchen door. He placed a gentle hand on Rachel's shaking shoulder. "I do this because I love you," he said softly. "We must clean ourselves of sin." Then he walked away, calling cheerfully to their son in the living room as if nothing had happened. Rachel slid to the kitchen floor, her back burning with discomfort, tears streaming silently down her face. She thought about the Thomas she had married, respected church youth leader, beloved son of Pastor Mitchell, kind and gentle during their dating. That Thomas had never raised his voice, had opened doors for her, had quoted scripture about cherishing wives as Christ cherished the church. That Thomas had disappeared immediately after they got married. Their wedding day had been perfect, a fairy tale event fitting for the heir to Pastor Mitchell. Thomas, like his father, was very wealthy, and he spared no expense, his money ensuring that every detail was flawless. The church overflowed with roses, the reception held at his family's large estate. Rachel had felt like a princess. That night, in the honeymoon suite of his private island resort, Rachel waited nervously for her husband. When Thomas emerged from the bathroom, she noticed something strange in his hand, a thin leather belt, folded over. "Thomas?" she questioned, confused. "Eve led Adam to sin," he said, his voice suddenly different from any she'd heard from him before. "And so began woman's journey in suffering." What followed was hard for Rachel to understand. The belt against her bare skin, Thomas quoting scripture between strikes, and occasionally saying, "God, take power from the serpent, you are of your father, for he has been a liar, and so you are a liar." Afterward came tender touches and whispered words of love as he took her virginity. He held her close, wiping away her tears, explaining that this was God's design for marriage. Correction followed by pleasure. "This is how we stay pure," he whispered. "This is how we honor God in our union." Rachel, raised in the same conservative church, had never heard of such practices. But Thomas spoke with such confidence, such certainty, that she questioned her own understanding rather than his. Perhaps this was what marriage truly meant, giving into all things, even this. The pattern continued. Intimacy became something Rachel both wanted and dreaded, craving her husband's tenderness while fearing the cleansing that always came before it. "Mommy, are you crying?" A voice snapped her back to reality. 6-year-old Ethan appeared in the doorway of the bathroom, clutching his worn teddy bear. His innocent eyes clouded with a worry no child should carry. Rachel quickly wiped her tears and turned, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "No, sweetheart. Mommy's just praying." Ethan wasn't convinced. He stepped closer, reaching up with small fingers to touch the dark mark on Rachel's cheek. "Did Daddy hurt you again?" The simple question pierced Rachel's heart. Children see everything, understand more than we think. Rachel's throat tightened as she knelt down, cupping her son's face in her hands. "Listen to me, baby," she whispered. "No matter what happens, I love you, and I'll always protect you. You understand?" Ethan nodded seriously, but before he could speak, heavy footsteps approached. The air in the room changed instantly, like oxygen being pulled away. Rachel felt it, and so did Ethan. Thomas was coming, and he disliked finding them hiding in the bathroom. "Go to your room now," she whispered urgently. Ethan hesitated only a second before obeying, disappearing down the hall just as the bathroom door swung open. For 3 more years, the pattern continued. Rachel endured the harsh treatment. She made excuses to emergency room nurses, to teachers who noticed Ethan's withdrawn behavior, to her brother David who called less and less because Thomas didn't approve of his lifestyle. He's just passionate about his faith. Things will get better. But they didn't get better. Thomas's cleansings grew more frequent. She'd researched women's shelters, hidden away small amounts of money, even packed a bag once. But each time, she looked at Ethan and hesitated. Thomas Mitchell was not just wealthy. He was powerful. His family name adorned hospital wings and university buildings. His father's church was the largest in the state. What chance would she have against such influence? Then there were the pregnancies. 3 times Rachel had conceived after their purification. 3 times her body, stressed and worn, had failed to carry the child to term. The first 2 miscarriages happened early, Thomas barely acknowledging the loss beyond a scripture verse about God's will. The third was different. Rachel had been nearly 5 months along when Thomas found her text messages to David. Nothing wrong, just a simple check-in with her brother. But Thomas saw betrayal in the communication with someone he deemed immoral. "You bring sin into our home," he'd yelled, the belt coming down harder than ever before. Rachel had collapsed that night, blood soaking through her clothes. Thomas, suddenly panicked, had driven her to the emergency room himself, creating a story about a fall down the stairs. The doctor's eyes had held suspicion but not surprise. This wasn't the first case they'd seen, even among the wealthy elite. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Mitchell," the doctor had said quietly. "You've lost the baby." Later, as Rachel lay in the hospital bed, her body empty and aching, David had arrived, his face tight with barely controlled anger. "You're not going back there," he'd insisted. "Not this time." "I have to. Ethan," Rachel had whispered. "We'll get Ethan too," David promised. "But you need to heal first." Rachel had allowed David to take her to his modest home across town, far different from the Mitchell mansion but warm in ways her marital home had never been. For 2 weeks, she recovered, gathering strength. Thomas called constantly, switching between threats and pleas, between quoting scripture about a wife's duty and promising to change. When she felt strong enough, Rachel insisted on returning, not to stay, but to retrieve her son. Thomas was surprisingly calm when they arrived, his usual commanding presence weakened. He'd lost weight, his normally perfect appearance untidy. The mansion, usually flawless under the care of a full staff, showed signs of neglect. Through the open door, Rachel could see empty whiskey bottles on the coffee table, shocking for a man who'd always condemned alcohol as sinful. "You came back," he said, relief clear in his voice. "I came for Ethan," Rachel replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The breaking point came later that day. Ethan had accidentally knocked over a glass of grape juice, staining the white tablecloth Thomas's mother had given them as a wedding present. "You can't even teach your son to respect our blessings?" Thomas shouted, moving toward Ethan with his belt already in hand. "Spare the rod, spoil the child." Rachel instinctively placed herself between them. "Thomas, please, he's just a child. Move," Thomas ordered, his voice dangerously low. "The boy must learn." "No," Rachel replied, surprising even herself with the firmness in her voice. What happened next was a blur. Thomas's anger exploded. Rachel took the blows, shielding Ethan with her body. When it was over, Thomas stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard a framed Bible verse fell from the wall and shattered across the floor. That night, as Rachel tended to her fresh marks in the bathroom, her hands shaking too badly to open the bottle of ointment, she made a decision. She couldn't stay anymore, not for herself, and certainly not for Ethan. With trembling hands, she packed a small bag with essentials and waited for morning. At breakfast, Thomas seemed calmer, almost sorry, though he never apologized. "I have a men's prayer breakfast and meetings all day," he said. "Don't wait for me." Rachel nodded, keeping her face neutral. As soon as he left, she called her brother David. "I need to leave," she whispered into the phone, constantly glancing at the door afraid Thomas might return. "Today, David, today." David didn't hesitate. "I'm coming to get you. Pack only what you need." Hours later, as Rachel and Ethan were preparing to leave, Thomas returned unexpectedly. His eyes narrowed at the sight of the packed bag. "Where do you think you're going?" he demanded, his voice eerily quiet. Rachel tried to stand tall, though her heart pounded against her ribs. "I'm leaving, Thomas. I can't do this anymore." Thomas's face darkened. "You're not taking my son anywhere." "Yes, she is," came a voice from the doorway. David stood there, his jaw set in determination. Thomas turned, fury changing his features. "This is family business. Get out of my house, sinner." "My sister and nephew are my family," David replied, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Rachel, take Ethan and wait in the car." Rachel hesitated, afraid to leave the two men alone. "Go," David insisted. As she hurried Ethan outside, she heard raised voices, then a crash. Minutes later, David emerged, a cut above his eye but otherwise unhurt. "He's letting you go," David said, his voice tight. "But he's keeping Ethan." Rachel's world stopped. "No, I can't leave without my son." "You have to," David replied grimly. "For now." He threatened to call the police, claim you're unstable. "His father is respected in this town, Rachel. We need to be smart about this." Tears streaming down her face, Rachel knelt in front of Ethan. "I'll come back for you," she promised, her voice breaking. "Be brave for mommy, okay?" Ethan clung to her, sobbing. Thomas appeared at the door, watching with cold eyes as David physically had to separate mother and son. "Mommy! Don't leave me!" Ethan screamed as David guided Rachel to the car. His cries pierced her heart like physical pain. "I'll be back for you," she called, though her words were nearly drowned by her son's desperate pleas. "I promise, baby. I promise." The week that followed was awful. Rachel stayed at David's place, barely eating, unable to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Ethan's cries. She called the house repeatedly, but Thomas either didn't answer or hung up as soon as he heard her voice. "I should have never left him," she whispered one night, staring at her untouched dinner. "What kind of mother leaves her child? A mother who needs to be safe to help her child," David said firmly. "You can't protect Ethan if you're gone, Rachel." The words were harsh but true. Thomas's bad behavior had been getting worse. How long until a belt became something worse? Rachel found herself thinking dark thoughts, imagining what would happen if Thomas simply disappeared. A car accident. A sudden illness. She would shake herself when these thoughts came, horrified at where her desperation was leading her. David watched his sister growing weaker and finally had enough. "We're getting Ethan back," he announced one morning, his voice leaving no room for argument. They drove to Thomas's house. David pounded on the door until Thomas opened it. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes and stubble covering his usually clean-shaven face. The smell of alcohol hung heavy in the air around him. "What do you want?" Thomas snapped. "My sister is here for her belongings," David announced, stepping forward so Thomas had to back up or be walked into. "Every valuable item that belongs to her." Thomas laughed without humor. "Take whatever you want. Just be quick about it. The Tiffany jewelry is in the safe. The car keys are in my study. Take all your jewels." Rachel rushed past him, calling for Ethan. She found him in his room, sitting on his bed, looking smaller than she remembered. When he saw her, his face lit up, and he flew into her arms. "Mommy! You came back!" "Of course I did, baby," she whispered, holding him tight. "I promised, didn't I?" Rachel began gathering Ethan's clothes, his favorite toys, his books. Thomas watched from the doorway, swaying slightly, arms crossed. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice surprisingly empty. "I'm taking my son," Rachel replied without looking at him. "No," Thomas said, but there was no force behind it. "He stays." David appeared behind Thomas. "She's taking him, and you're not going to stop her. You don't understand. I need him." "You should have thought about that before you started using scripture as an excuse to hurt my sister," David replied. "Before you made her lose 3 babies with your cleansings." A tense silence filled the room. Rachel continued packing, trying to ignore the men's standoff. "At least," Thomas finally said, his voice barely audible, "at least stay the night. Let me say goodbye properly." Rachel froze. Thomas had never asked for anything. He had always commanded in the name of God and duty. David immediately shook his head. "No way. Rachel, we're leaving. Now." But Rachel saw something in Thomas's eyes she'd never seen before, weakness. maybe even regret. One night, she said, surprising both men. Just one night, to talk about arrangements for Ethan. David strongly disagreed, but Rachel stood firm. I'll be fine, she assured him. Come back in the morning. After getting a promise from Thomas that he wouldn't try to stop Rachel from leaving with Ethan in the morning, David reluctantly agreed to leave. But not before pulling Rachel aside. If he so much as raises his voice, you call me. I'll be here in 5 minutes. That evening, after Ethan was asleep, Rachel and Thomas sat in the living room, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. Why did you stay? Thomas finally asked, more sober now but still holding a half-empty glass. All those years. Why? Rachel considered the question. Because I loved you, and I kept hoping you'd become the man I thought I married. The man you pretended to be before our wedding night. Thomas's eyes filled with unexpected tears. I don't know what happened to that man, he whispered. Maybe he never existed. They talked late into the night, Thomas opening up about things he never shared. His father, the respected pastor, had been privately mean and demanding. Behind closed doors, Pastor Mitchell had disciplined his wife and son with the same righteous anger Thomas now displayed. Thomas had grown up believing that a man's love was shown through control and correction. The first time my father used his belt on me, I was 4, Thomas admitted. He said it was God's love working through him. That night, he read me Bible stories and tucked me in so gently. I grew up thinking that's what love looked like, pain followed by tenderness. And that's why you wait until after we're intimate, Rachel said softly. You correct me for the sin you think we've committed. Thomas nodded, shame washing over his features. I swore I'd never be like him, but here I am, worse than he ever was. Our babies, Rachel whispered. 3 children we lost because of this. Thomas flinched as if struck. I told myself it was God's will, he said, his voice breaking. But it was my hand that caused it, wasn't it? As the night wore on, Thomas's tiredness became clear. His words began to slur again, though this time from fatigue rather than alcohol. Rachel helped him to bed, surprised when he didn't resist. Don't leave, he murmured as sleep claimed him. Please! Rachel sat beside him until his breathing deepened, then slipped out to check on Ethan. She made a decision. She called David. I need your help, she said. And I need you not to ask questions. Thomas woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains. He sat up quickly, confused and disoriented. This wasn't his bedroom. The walls were a pale blue instead of the stark white he preferred. The furniture was simple. Through an open window, he could hear birds singing and the gentle sound of a stream. Rachel! He called out, voice rough with panic. Ethan! Where am I? He jumped from the bed. This wasn't his property. Nothing about this place resembled the carefully kept grounds of his estate. Rachel! He shouted again. Am I being held prisoner? Let me out of here! To his surprise, Rachel appeared on the door. We're here, she said quietly. Thomas stared at her, confusion and anger battling across his face. Where am I? What is this place? Rachel approached carefully, sitting on the edge of the bed. This is David's property. The guest house part of it. You've been asleep for almost 30 hours. 30 hours? That's impossible. How? You sort of fainted after our talk, Rachel explained. The doctor said it was extreme tiredness combined with the sleeping pills in your drink. You drugged me? Thomas asked, shocked. Rachel met his gaze. You needed rest, and I needed to think clearly without fear. For once. Thomas looked around, taking in his surroundings. So this is where you want to stay with my son? Our son, Rachel corrected gently. And yes. Thomas's jaw tightened. You had no right to bring me here. I know, she admitted. But I had to. Why? Make me understand. Rachel took a deep breath. You told me to take my valuables and jewels before I left. Thomas frowned. What are you talking about? What does that have to do with my being here? I took you, she said simply. Thomas stared at her, not understanding. I could have taken my diamond ring and gold jewelries, the cars, the clothes. Rachel continued. I could have taken half your fortune in a divorce. But none of that matters. Despite everything, Thomas, you're still my husband, still Ethan's father. You could still be the man I once believed you to be. The man I glimpsed before you started twisting scripture into a tool against me. I mean, you're my jewel, my most valuable jewel. She said this with a teary eye. Something inside Thomas broke. Years of built-up walls crumbled in an instant. He began to cry. Deep sobs shook his entire body. He slid from the bed to his knees, grasping her hands. I'm sorry, he gasped between sobs. I'm so sorry, Rachel. For everything. For the pain, the fear, the scars, both the ones you can see and the ones you can't. For our babies that never got to be born because of me. I don't deserve forgiveness. I don't deserve you or Ethan. I thought I had everything, with houses and properties across the world, but what can I possibly give you to make this right? What could ever be enough? Rachel looked at him, her heart aching for the man she had once loved and the boy within him who had never learned how to love properly. Give me your heart, Thomas, she said softly. All of it. And stay with me here, away from everything else, until we can figure out what love truly means. Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his face. For the first time, he saw a glimmer of hope, a chance to rebuild what he had destroyed. In the days that followed, David insisted Thomas see a specialist. At first, Thomas resisted. I don't need some godless therapist telling me how to live my life, Thomas growled. I just need to pray more. Prayer hasn't stopped you from hurting your wife, David replied. Maybe God is providing help through other people. Eventually, Rachel's quiet determination wore Thomas down. I'm not asking you to abandon your faith, she said. I'm asking you to consider that God might work through doctors and counselors too. The sessions were difficult. Thomas returned from them raw and tired, often going to his room for hours afterward. The first time he went, he insisted on being driven to a neighboring county where no one would recognize him. What will people think if they see Thomas Mitchell going to therapy? He'd asked anxiously. Maybe they'll think you're human like the rest of us, David had replied. Gradually, the therapist, a Christian counselor who understood Thomas's religious framework, helped him unpack the painful experiences he'd buried for decades. His father's harshness disguised as religious discipline. His mother's silent acceptance. The twisted theology that had warped his understanding of love and marriage. Your brain developed in a state of constant stress, the therapist explained. Your understanding of Scripture was filtered through that pain. What you learned wasn't God's love, it was your father's distortion of it. It doesn't excuse what I did, Thomas told Rachel after one particularly difficult session. Nothing excuses that. But I'm learning, Rachel. I'm learning to see God's love clearly for the first time, without my father's shadow over it. Life at the family property followed the rhythms of nature rather than the demands of Thomas's business empire. They woke to birdsong instead of alarm clocks. Meals were simple affairs made with vegetables from David's garden. The water came from a natural spring, sweet and cold. Thomas, who had never been without luxury, found himself strangely drawn to this simpler existence. While Thomas underwent therapy, he also made the difficult decision to step back from his business empire. He hired a trusted CEO to manage the daily operations of his company, only attending to the most pressing matters. His focus was now on healing, on rebuilding his relationship with his family. Rachel watched his efforts with cautious hope. She had her own healing to do, her own therapy sessions to attend. Trust didn't return overnight. For months, she insisted that David stay in the main house while she and Ethan lived with Thomas in the guest house. Slowly, gradually, Thomas began to change. He attended a recovery program at a different church across town. He even joined a support group for men working to overcome harmful behaviors. Most importantly, he began rebuilding his relationship with Ethan. Not as an authority figure demanding obedience, but as a father who listened, who played, who apologized when he was wrong. It's a year now. Thomas and Rachel return to their city homes sometimes, but they insist that they love the simple life of the outskirts, and so Thomas got them a nice duplex building here in the outskirts of town. Ethan attends a good school here and Thomas has more time for family as he now works remotely from his laptop. Thomas walks in carrying Ethan on his shoulders. They just returned from school. Rachel stands at the balcony. She's pregnant again. Her stomach bulges. Her left hand is lightly placed on her belly. Thomas and Ethan wave energetically, with smiles so wide. Rachel waves back and smiles, thinking to herself, "Love always finds a way, love conquers all." This story reminds us that healing is possible even in the darkest circumstances. When Rachel chose to see Thomas as valuable despite his flaws, she created space for genuine transformation. Her courage to try a different path, one of compassion rather than escape, ultimately broke a cycle that had persisted for generations. Through professional help, honest confrontation, and the safety of a new environment, Thomas found his way back to the man he could have been. Their journey shows us that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is to see beyond someone's worst actions to the wounded person beneath. It's not about excusing the inexcusable, but about finding a different way forward when both punishment and abandonment seem like the only options. I'm interested in knowing this. If you were Rachel, would you have done the same?
If you enjoy African stories, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and click on the bell button so that you'd be notified whenever we post.